Welcome to the Tela Network podcast. I'm StJohn Piano, CMO at Tela Network and CTO at Solidi Exchange. Today, my guest is Isaac Piano, who has worked in military communications for the last 5 years. If you would like to contact Isaac Piano, his details will be included in the episode description. Thanks for joining us, Isaac.
No worries, my pleasure.
How are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Just busy summer day, isn't it?
So, the main point of interest for me, and I'm guessing for a lot of other people, is in the war in Ukraine, who is actually winning, Russia or Ukraine?
That's actually quite a difficult question to answer. If you'd asked me that perhaps 6 months to a year ago, I probably would have said Russia. The slight change that's happened recently has been the Ukrainian invasion of Russia, because prior to that, there were peace talks going on. So the Ukrainians were in the middle of their peace talks or moving towards that, and the invasion of Russia has just put those on hold. I think it appears what they're trying to do is get themselves into a position where they can negotiate. There's a stronger negotiating position. There's no real definite answer to that right now.
Okay. Which side has generally been doing better in the fighting, at least over the last while?
Again, it depends on how you look at it, because the Russians, just because they have significantly more soldiers, they have a much larger population from which to draw. They have been winning field battles continually, and they've captured a large number of towns. The Ukrainian offensive last year didn't really work that well, and having read a few reports, is primarily based on the fact that they didn't have enough equipment, didn't have enough money. They had soldiers, but they didn't have enough equipment supplied from the West. If you look at it in different spheres, so the communications battle, for example, or the propaganda battle, Ukraine's winning that one, or at least that's kind of the view that we get here in the West. In Russia, Russia is definitely winning the war in a propaganda way, because they are controlling their own population. They've got a number of allies, kind of in that central Asian area. But here, Ukraine has done an incredibly good job of convincing the West to continue supporting.
I wonder, it would be very interesting to find out which one China and India think is winning.
That would be very informative. I suppose the fact that the Chinese haven't really gone whole hog in supporting Russia is an indication that they think Russia can probably do it. Obviously, there's other factors, so they don't want to be being seen as aggressive by the West. They don't want to annoy the Americans, so they've kind of got to keep a hands-off approach. But the willingness to support the Russians, but not full hog, indicates to me, at least, that they kind of view the Russians as being able to win, or at the very least keep the war going. Because that's in the Chinese incentive to make sure that the Americans and the West are focused on Ukraine, and that takes away tension from other parts of the world where China's interested.
Yes. So, well, to move on, you work in the communication operations side of the army. So this is something you could tell people about that would not normally be known. What have you seen happening in the war from a communications perspective?
So back in, over New Year's, or Christmas, New Year's 2023 to 2024, a really good example of how communications have been used in a slightly asymmetrical way, a way that you wouldn't normally expect. The Ukrainians dropped missiles and bombs on a Russian barracks based in the east of Ukraine. And the way they were able to tell how many soldiers there were, or that there was a large number of soldiers in that barracks away from the front line, was they produced a heat map from all the mobile phone signals.
Oh.
And all the mobile phones were being used by Russian soldiers at that time because they were sending messages back to their families for New Year's.
Oh, oh, that's grim.
So as soon as they sent the messages, they were able to produce a heat map, and they saw the red zone, and then they dropped missiles on a barracks and killed. It's somewhere in the between 100 to 200. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all's fair in love and war.
Yes, it's a strong indication that, well, in previous wars, if you were on the front, you you obviously accepted there was a higher likelihood of dying. However, now it's similar to the Second World War and the ability for people to bomb each other and bomb civilians. That was new, and this is really new, where we can find heat maps, we can use that to find troop buildups, even if they're just in barracks, and then you can attack them that way.
What do you think? Has anyone thought about how to adapt, to defend, or to prevent this being?
The only real adaptation is, well, there are two, and there's one that we currently use, which is you take away everyone's mobile phones. The problem with that is that it's not entirely secure. People may have second phones. They may think, oh, it's just a WhatsApp message. It doesn't really matter. So the only other way that I would be able to say for sure this is a way to combat this is to have Faraday cages, where you literally just force people not to be able to message, and you go on full radio silence.
Is there any? I mean, this is just naively, but is there any way to have walkie-talkies internally and then funnel all of those into some cable that you run physically?
You can. It's possible. I've not seen it done, and I wouldn't exactly know how it would work.
All I have in mind is that your broadcast signal would be coming from somewhere that was located far away from the barracks.
That's not a hard and fast way of doing it. The current way of doing it is hiding signals in the noise. So we use electronic warfare equipment, which will be able to create signals in a different place. And so you create a cloud of noise, essentially a cloud of signals, and it's really hard to pinpoint signals. So you hide in obscurity. That's probably the safest way of doing it.
Well, that ties into something I've discussed with Nick about how we're operating in an environment where many sides have accurate satellite imagery, and in such a time, what can be the defense? And one possible answer is that we're going to head into a time of data generation on a scale that's just unreal.
Yes. I think that's where AI comes in, where it's just signals are just created in order to create this cloud and obscurity.
Yeah. So we're going to have effectively the media equivalent of 1,000 Earths, like 1,000 normal activity. But
Yeah.
and then okay, that's going to be weird. We could stay on that for a while, but I'm going to try and keep this moving. Run through 4 more questions and keep this down to under 20 minutes. Number 3, is Russia ready militarily for a war with all of NATO?
No. The main reason being, well, not by themselves. So the way that wars are currently fought is that gone are the days of one major power. Not that this necessarily ever existed in really, but one major power providing the bulk, and being able to conquer all of its enemies. We live and work in conglomerations of allies. So NATO being a really good example. Russia has the collective security organization, which was set up after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then they also have China, they have North Korea as just kind of geographical allies. And Russia by itself would, at this point, having lost upwards of maybe 100,000 soldiers in Ukraine does not have the power to fight NATO by itself. However, um, the reality is that NATO is not necessarily as strong as they say it is, especially if the American attention is divided.
Well, so in that case, let me turn the question around. Is NATO physically capable of fighting and winning a war with Russia and operating at that distance?
Theoretically, yes. It depends how much attention the Americans have, because American power is the reason that NATO exists. Because without the Americans, NATO would be a shell of what it is. So if
Okay.
they are, sorry, go ahead.
Uh, um, well, just on that basis, imagine NATO minus the Americans against Russia.
Again, yes, in theory, because NATO is big, and if every single army were to provide 25 to 30,000 soldiers, that's a lot of soldiers. The problem which a lot of Western militaries have right now is that their equipment, you can see it through the news, the equipment is not really up to standard to fight a modern war. A lot of it doesn't work, and they've had a lot of funding problems for the last 20 years.
So there's the paper NATO and the actual on the ground NATO.
Yes. And there was an article in Telegraph not too long ago about how the number of soldiers that NATO has on paper is not the number of soldiers they'd be able to put into the field.
Well, nuts.
Yeah. It's likely that we will depend on Eastern European allies such as Poland initially.
Okay. Question number 4 out of 6. Apart from trying to degrade the Russian economy, what are the advantages to the West in supporting Ukraine?
So the major advantage that the West and NATO gets in general is that they are able to fight a proxy war without actually having to degrade their own militaries. Yes, they're having to spend a lot of money, and economically it's quite trying for a lot of the smaller nations with smaller budgets. However, one thing that the Western militaries are able to do is they can send their surplus equipment and surplus weapons and weapons that are coming to the end of their shelf lives
Oh,
to send them to Ukraine and test them. And so let's say a Javelin anti-tank missile has been sitting on the shelf for X amount of years. It's coming to the end of its shelf life. We need to use it. And so it's sent to Ukraine to be used and also to test it out and see if it works, essentially.
Are they working?
Yes, very effectively, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, great.
Not so good for the Russian tank commanders, but
No.
yes.
Number 5. I've seen multiple former British Army service chiefs give public warnings over the last few years, really, about the state of the British Army. In the event of a major war, is Britain itself actually capable of deploying an army to Eastern Europe?
There's actually a large proportion of British troops already in Eastern Europe. Not in Ukraine. The obvious one that's known is Estonia. That's public information. The thing to bear in mind when you get the head of the army, head of the British Army, talking about all these warnings, is that there's an incentive because since 2010. Well, since 2006, the British Army budget has been cut and cut and cut, along with many other things, but it's been one of the public services which has had its budget slashed. And so there's an incentive for these chiefs of the army or chiefs of the navy, etc., to warn people and to get the public sentiment and public debate going, because that will increase their budgets.
Yeah, I see. It's almost it's difficult to separate the truth from a defensive maneuver.
It is. That's not to say that the British Army is, it is underfunded and has, well, a better way of saying that is that it's had its budget slashed. and there is debate now about how do we prepare for Russian aggression or sustained Russian aggression.
Interesting. So, really, my last question is, in your opinion, from your point of view only, how does this all shake out? What do you think are some of the possible outcomes of the conflict over the next 3 to 5 years?
That's quite a difficult thing to pinpoint. I think the most useful model I have in my head is what historical parallels are there for this war? Uh, the primary example being the Spanish Civil War, which was used by both sides as a way of testing military equipment, testing tactics, and it also provides a microcosm of how a future war will look. So the Spanish Civil War was the Second World War in a microcosm.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good, if slightly worrying note to end on. So